Welcome to episode 49 of the Landlady Boss podcast. I'm here with my sister and co-host Rachel. Hello, Rachel. How are you doing?
Great. Marie, you've had a busy week. I've had a busy week.
I will say it's been a few weeks since we've even been able to record a podcast, and thank you for everyone's patience because I have been doing graduation things and also traveling to Nicaragua to check on my project there. And Rachel, you're traveling around right now, right? And well, you've done a couple trips in the last few weeks.
Yes, a lot. Yeah, we went to the UK and then now we were in Prague yesterday, well today, and then now we just took a train to Vienna. So we're showing my husband's family all over Europe. We're doing a big long train and car road trip, and it's amazing. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful.
Well, thank you for finding a time to squeeze in a little podcast. And this is also noteworthy. It's episode 49, which is wonderful, but someone also has a birthday in a few days and may or may not be turning 49.
49.
I'm not
I
going to say
am.
who, but happy
I
birthday early.
am 49 on our 49th podcast in 3 days. So this is why we actually delayed so that we could
That's right.
create a 49th episode on my 49th birthday.
It works perfectly. I
Yeah.
know. And next week would be 50. This is amazing. I just cannot believe it's been a year since we
Yes.
started this podcast, and has been such a wonderful experience, wonderful ride. We've got great listeners. Thank you so much for being with us throughout this entire journey. And hopefully the content that we have created over the last year has been helpful to you as a landlady and a property manager. If you have content or questions or things that you would love for us to cover, please email us at landladybosses@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you and are always looking for new topics. So let's get into today's topic. This is a little controversial. What do you do when you have tenants that break up? Uh-oh. Dum-dum-dum.
Dun, dun, dun.
This happens. You have tenants that everything's wonderful when they sign the lease. They're in love and everything's great, and then they break up mid-lease. Or they're friends that are renting together and one gets a job halfway across the country. Or they are renting together and they have a friend that wants to join the party. So all of these things can be tricky situations and how to handle them with the lease. And so we thought it needed its own podcast because it has happened to both of us. And it can be kind of tricky and a little emotionally charged. And you might get angry calls and, he said this and she did this. And you're almost a therapist sometimes. So Rachel, has this happened? And if so, what was the situation like?
Well, I think like the more dramatic one would be when I've had somebody become incarcerated. So then they can't pay rent, and yet
Yes.
their roommate now has all of the obligation, and so they'd like to have that person taken off the lease. So I've had that happen before. I've had a divorce happen where one wanted to stay and one wanted to leave. It just, yeah, things happen a lot.
Life happens. Yeah, I've had the incarcerated ones, where they go to jail and then they can't pay the lease, or their partner or a friend is left paying the
Right.
lease on their own. And what do you do with that? I've had the nasty breakups where did they call you telling you stuff about me? They're lying and they're saying that, excuse me, I don't think that this is appropriate. So, and he said and she said, and they want me to know their side of the story. And I
Mhm.
don't care. I don't want to know too much information. So, you've had all those situations. And then I just got a call last week that they have a friend that's needing a place to stay, and they really wanted this friend to be able to move in with them.
Right.
And how do we handle that? So it can be tricky. Our main goal obviously is to protect our investment, right? We want to make sure that our properties are protected and taken care of. And so there are some things that you want to do when faced with these sticky situations to make sure that everything's legal, above board, and most importantly, that your property in the end is safe and protected.
Right. And I think it's important to know that when you have multiple people sign a lease, that they are jointly and severely liable. It means each one of them is responsible for 100% of the rent. So if you have 3 people sign up, it's not that they're responsible for 33%. They're responsible, each one, for 100%. And so what they do and who pays and how much each one pays each month is between them. But that's when it gets a little bit sticky, when you have 3 people or 4 or 2, and one leaves, and then that's why we need to bring this up, because it is a little bit more complicated, because each one is responsible for 100% of the rent.
Right. And if you're the friend or the ex or whatever that's left at the end of the lease, when everyone else has abandoned you, you're responsible. So, and if those other people's names are still on the lease, they technically are responsible too, but if you can't find them, so you want to make sure that you're documenting everything first. When a tenant approaches you about a situation, you want to make sure that you document it, maybe request it in writing, and just really covering yourself so that you aren't accused of things doing illegal stuff later on or something like that.
And remember, as a landlady boss, that you do not just agree with the first person who calls you. So you might get pulled into their arguments or a divorce or something, and you feel so sympathetic to that first tenant who contacts you. But there's another side, there's another story. So you just want to keep it very professional, and don't make any promises, and try not to get pulled into a back and forth text message. Just make sure you understand what's going on and follow your contract. Super important.
Right. Review the lease, and if they're asking you, no, we need to leave, or I'm out of here or something, you're like, okay, well, let's review the lease, and what does it say for early termination? And you go back to the lease. It's good if they're communicating with you at least. Sometimes they leave without even telling you, and they say, oh, well, they moved out last month, or okay, well, then we need to reassess, and I like to do a new lease with the person that's left, so that you get the name of the other person off the lease. You can even do a form or something that is going to be an addendum to the lease, but also like liability
release. Right, where the departing tenants and they sign, but really the most important one is that the one that's left signs and says that they are now responsible for the apartment as is, the unit is as is, because you're going to have, without fail, I've even had this happen where it's time for them to move out, and they say, well, that bedroom furniture isn't mine, that's the first guy who left. I said, no, everything in this is now yours. You took over the lease, so you need to get rid of it.
You're responsible to return it to its original condition. Yeah, because what happens is if someone's moved out and then the last person's left, well, they say, I didn't do that damage. That was caused by so and so. And it's like, well, they haven't been here for 8 months and they left and you were okay with this. And so, it's important. Hopefully you can get prior warning and you can handle this before the person actually leaves. So you can go through, you can even inspect the property if you want and see the current condition. Do a video. You can document all of that. If they're going to want their deposit returned, then you're going to want to make sure that you have a signed statement saying, I'm returning this, but I need the full amount, and you want to get the full amount from the person that's staying. So however you want to do that, either if you want to refund part of it, or you want to say that's between you two, I'm keeping the deposit with the property, however you want to handle that, but you want to make sure that you're not left giving up part of the deposit without receiving it back and not knowing the condition of the unit or the rental. So you can see how this can get sticky very quickly.
Right. In fact, that's a funny thing, because if one leaves and they want half the deposit, then you don't forget that you need to get the other half brought up to its full amount from the person remaining. You want a full deposit in hand. So I guess you got to consider your options. And so after you look at your lease, and maybe this is a good time to check out your lease, and as we're talking, and see what are the options in it. One thing you can do is release the departing tenant from the lease entirely and leave only the remaining tenant responsible. And so that would need an addendum to the existing contract, so that you're removing the departing tenant, and then the other one signs that they are now responsible for the apartment as is. So that would be option one. Option two would be finding a replacement tenant to take over the departing tenant's portion. Now, in my contract, the tenant can find a replacement tenant. If I'm having to find it, then they're basically essentially breaking their lease, and there's other penalties. And that brings us to option three, which is both tenants agree to break their lease and endure the appropriate penalties of whatever that is in your lease. And then the fourth option would be requiring both tenants to honor the full lease term regardless of their personal situation. So you say, well, you have 3 more months on your lease. You need to finish that, and and then you can part ways. Or even if one of you is not living there, I'm not responsible for who's spending the night or not. You both are on the lease. So that's something that you can do also. You can just say, this is your lease. So those are a couple options. Marie, do you have other thoughts on those?
Well, I would definitely say on your option where you said they could, you allow them to go find a replacement, I would reiterate that they still have to follow your application guidelines. So,
Yes.
when someone is finding a replacement, it maybe is a little different in student housing like you do than, where I am with single family housing. I don't allow them technically to find a replacement. I guess if they said they had someone in mind, I would say, okay, they can fill out an application and they can go through our normal process, because what you don't want to happen is they're like, oh, hey, my buddy's here, he's going to pay the rent and I'm out. And you want to make sure that the person you're allowing to come in is someone that you would normally rent to. And so they need to still follow all of your application guidelines and credit scores and background checks and do all of that. So when I had this tenant call last week and say, I want a friend to move in with me, I said, okay, that's fine, but we would still need them to pay to do the application fee, the background check, the credit check, and all. We do all of the same process that you did to move in. And they said, oh, okay, yeah, I don't know that he wants to do that. Well, because he probably couldn't pass all of that, and they knew that. So, it protects you, it protects the people that are already living in that rental, and so they don't get into a situation that they're unaware of. So that's important to stress. Make sure you still follow your rules. Don't make exceptions just because someone got a job in another state or someone's breaking up. You still need to follow your systems and rules.
Right. No, it's really good. Yeah. So I do a transfer fee of $100, but I do also require that if they find somebody to take their contract over, that they do have to go through the whole background check with me. So I think that's important, because you can't just have anybody just because they're having a problem, then you get a problem tenant. So yeah, I agree. Now, like for tenants in a situation, I think that if you put yourself in the tenant's seat instead of the landlady seat, the tenants, as they have things that come up, a good tenant would communicate early. And so understanding what a good tenant would do helps you let them know kind of what the process is, I think. So if they start saying something about like, well, what happens if we leave early, or what happens if I want to add somebody to my lease, pick up on these, because I think your conversation would be, well, the earlier you let me know, the more options you'll have. Because let's just say you decide you want to transfer your contract. Well, it takes a while to advertise, to find somebody, to have them do the background check, for them to pay the background fee. All of these things take time. And so if they're going to let the landlady know just like 24 hours before someone wants to move out, that's not going to be an option. So I think letting them know, the more time they have, the more options they'll have. Yeah, I think that's an important one.
Yeah, and then also reviewing occupancy limits. You need to make sure that if they're wanting to have someone move in and they're already at the max number of occupants you can have legally, that's something you need to look for your state, that you can't do that, you're already at the max. And so looking at that and reviewing your lease to update it also. So making sure that anyone that is coming in, as we mentioned before, or is leaving, you got to update that lease so that you're not left with people that you can't find or locate, or who knows where they're at, and they are responsible and you're stuck. So make sure that doing that addendum or getting the new lease done
right.
is important.
Also letting them know that they can't just stop paying rent. That a lot of people kind of just think, well, that's what my deposit's there for. So I'm just going to stop paying rent, take my deposit, it's fine. But if they have 6 more months on their lease, they don't understand that that's 6 months they're obligated to pay. So I think educating your tenants that's part of the contract is that they're obligated for 6 months unless something else happens. That you've released them from the lease in writing, that you both have agreed for them to leave. I mean, that requires both of you to agree in order for them not to be legally responsible for rent.
Right, and you might have to renegotiate the rent. I mean, just because it's been that set amount, but if they want multiple people to move in, I had one lady that I've rented to for a long time, and she lived alone. And then she wanted her son and his wife and daughter to move in with her, which, it was still okay for the occupancy limits. That worked for the number of people allowed in the rental, but it also is more wear and tear. And she paid a set utility amount because it was shared meters. And so, we had to rework the amount that she would pay because now it's more wear and tear, but also, her utilities are going to be way higher. And so we had to adjust for that just because it was going from 1 to 4 people. So you might have to adjust the rent depending on the situation.
Right. Another option, and this one is a little bit more complicated, would be to consider subletting. And a lot of landladies don't really like this one because it removes a lot of the power that you feel you have. If they go and find somebody, they're responsible. They can collect a deposit if they want. I've even held on to a deposit for somebody that is sublet to. But the reason why it's complicated is because they ultimately are responsible from beginning to end. So when they move in and when they move out, you are only dealing with the tenant that you have rented to. But in the middle, that's when they've had somebody else live there. And they've accepted that they are responsible for that person. So that's subletting, and that's one way that maybe they're moving out. They have 6 months left. They found somebody, and you don't want to, for whatever reason, just let them out and transfer it to a new tenant, which I think is probably a safer option to do. But for whatever reason, let's just say even it's a family member that they want to be there, and they said that they're willing to accept the responsibility, that's subletting.
Yeah, it would be a very sticky, tricky situation. I wouldn't typically do that. I have not done that because I would rather just have them leave the lease and they do whatever fees or penalties that they would incur and then find my own tenant and turn the rental over.
I've done it, and it's only because um, the rent was low enough that they were worried they needed to leave for doing they were students and they needed to leave for a semester to go do an internship, and then they wanted to come back and continue renting. And so there's this gap in the middle where they weren't going to be able to live there, but they wanted to sublet. And so I ended
That
up
makes a lot of sense.
it does, because they want to come back to their rent that they already have and their place, and they want to leave all their furniture and then have someone just move in for that, 4 months. So that's when it made sense, but then it got a little tricky. So I still had the people they found sign a lease because I wanted to make sure that they understood that noise ordinances were still in effect and that they were held responsible to the same rules. But I also did an addendum that said that any damage that they do is part of the damage that I will charge my tenant, that they are my tenant. So it was an
Right.
interesting thing, and I ended up collecting the deposit on the behalf of my tenant, but it worked out great. They found, because they knew they were on the hook for damage, they ended up doing a really good job finding a replacement couple to live there. So they were really, kind of due diligence because they didn't want someone to damage their furniture that they were leaving. So it worked
Right.
out.
Yeah, they would be very incentivized to choose very carefully because they're
Correct.
not there to check on things, but they are responsible. That would be very nerve-wracking.
Yes. hmm So you've kind of touched a couple times on adding someone to an existing lease, and it sounds like you've had this in the last week. I think this comes up a lot where People are realizing that rent is really expensive. They don't want to move. They like where they are. It could be close to work. For whatever reason, they want to stay, but rent is becoming onerous, you know? And so I think this is when they say, okay, can I bring someone into my lease? Or it could be a new relationship that they're in, or it could be an aging parent that they want to bring into their apartment. There's lots of reasons, but I'm getting more and more where people are asking if they can add someone to their lease. And the reason why this is a change is because on your lease, hopefully you have listed everybody who's living there. And if that person's not living there and they're staying longer than 1 week or two, it's considered, leasing without a contract. And it's important that you have everybody in there under your rules.
Yeah, I think the important thing to point out is that any of these scenarios, whether they are breaking up, whether they are having someone move in or multiple people moving in or caregiver, whatever the situation, they're all different things because it's life, right? We are dealing with people and they are in living different situations in their life and life happens. And so I think as landladies, we understand we have to be flexible with things, but we also have a lease and we have legalities that we follow. And so, I think it's really important to make sure that you have things clearly laid out, as we mentioned before, in your lease for what happens if someone leaves prematurely. What does that look like? Do you have fees? Do they have to pay an exit fee and responsible for the rent until the end of the lease? Or are there other things that they have to consider? And having that all laid out, but also understanding your state laws. There are different tenant rights laws that you're going to need to make sure that you understand. Some states even have laws protecting tenants if it's a breakup involving a domestic violent situation. And so, you're going to want to make sure that you are following your legal laws and not, possibly doing something illegal or making them, pay penalties when it involves a domestic dispute, and then you're left in trouble. So check those state laws out, making sure that you are aware of them and what happens in the situation of a really messy breakup.
Yeah, another situation is if somebody's called into service. So if they're called up and they need to go and break their lease, um, I don't know if it's every state, but I imagine they cannot have any problems breaking lease with their landlord. Like they need to be released because of their
Active duty, like if you
active
mean in the
duty.
military, if they're called
Yeah,
for active duty, yeah, I
yeah,
could see that being a
yeah,
situation too. You can't penalize them because now they're called up
yeah.
for
Right.
active duty. And checking your city and state laws also for, like we mentioned, the occupancy limits, like how many people can you technically have per room. If it's a 3-bedroom house, is it 6? Is it 2 people per room? Does your state have a rule? Is it 3? What are the laws? And I've actually had to, you know, um, have occupancy limits for my rentals. It's not even, my states are a lot more flexible, but I have my own occupancy limits just to prevent having, 8 people living in a 2-bedroom kind of situation, which could be a lot of wear and tear and problems that way. So make sure you're checking with your laws about, any lease modifications or security deposits or these occupancy limits so that you are following everything correctly in your own state.
Right. And you have to be really careful that it makes sense, that it's common sense also, so it's not um, violating any sort of fair housing considerations that would be like familial status. So you can't say, sorry, we don't rent to, 4 people if a 3-bedroom because we don't like families. Like, I mean, this could be a problem. So you have to be really careful on the fair housing considerations that you're screening your new tenants, making decisions about your lease modifications, all based on non-discriminatory behavior. So you're not discriminating on race, origin, religion, familial status, gender, all of the protected statuses. Um, keep track of that. So when in doubt, do use your attorney. Have him look over your contract, make sure that you're using proper and legal documents and contracts so that you are protected, and then follow them. You spend all this time having a contract. Make sure that when something comes up to challenge your contract, whether it's breaking a lease or doing something that is wrong or illegal in any of these cases, make sure that you are protected in your lease and then follow your lease.
Definitely, so that you're protected for sure. So, and I think it's important to be, as we talked about, flexible but fair. You want to be accommodating. You don't want to compromise your business, your rentals, the portfolio you built up, but you also want to be accommodating as much as you can, but making sure that you are charging reasonable penalties or fees. I mean, not just allowing people to leave willy-nilly, and making sure that they are following that, because it is a business. Sometimes we want to be so generous and kind-hearted, but you really also have to be taking care of your business, and making sure that you are somewhat flexible, but making sure your business is whole, your properties are in good hands, and that you are not being taken advantage of or left in the middle of winter with an empty unit that you have no way to fill, and you're just kind of stuck. So it's protecting you. So really make sure you do that. And then just trying to plan ahead. I really try to reach out to tenants with plenty of warning, saying, are you renewing your lease? Are you not? Are you staying? Just kind of communicating, really regular communication, and making sure that they have easy ways to communicate with you and feel like they can communicate with you, just to have that kind of open communication with them, so that you can know when these situations are coming, is going to be super helpful.
Right. And I find that if they're already your tenant and you've already been working with them and you know them, you've already set up them, they're already on the tenant portal, they're on the, electronic payment system, it's already going well. Then if something happens that changes it, like makes a hiccup or one of them has to leave, working with somebody that you already know is going to pay on time is far better than finding somebody new. So if they've been a pretty good tenant, I would work really hard to keep that tenant and figure out a way using an addendum or something else in order to keep at least one of them, so that you're the one that you have is better than the unknown.
Exactly. And not having to turn over your rental is worth a little bit of finagling, just because that could be weeks, a month or two. You never know how long it could take, and you don't know who you're going to get. So yeah, retaining a good tenant is so worth it. So, well, hopefully this has been helpful for you. It's always tricky when life events happen, and we try to have contracts and try to have everything laid out and anticipate every scenario, but sometimes relationships end, sometimes family members need a place to live. And when we deal with housing, it just gets sticky sometimes, and people have these life events. So making sure that you're on top of it, communicating with them, being clear, getting your leases updated is going to be so good in the future and protect your business. So good luck, happy renting, happy birthday to Rachel in 3 days. That's so exciting. What city will you be in on your birthday?
Vienna. So we just got
Vienna.
here.
I guess
Yep.
if you have to be in Vienna on your birthday, then deal with it. Sounds awful.
I could move here. This city is beautiful.
Oh, I
Every
bet it's
building
stunning.
is just gorgeous.
I've never been there, but I've seen pictures. I'll have to
Mm.
go someday. But good luck. Have a wonderful trip. It sounds heavenly. If you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe and share with other landlady bosses that can benefit from the information that we give. We would love to hear your topics or questions or ideas at landladybosses@gmail.com. And check out our website, landladyboss.com. We have different courses that can help you systemize your properties and help you be a better property manager, because no one's going to manage your property as well as you.